I love that song, though. It fits so well with the ideas that I'd like to share with you today. This idea of fire amongst the dreamer, this idea of how we stay connected. And what's interesting is that I'm finishing up the second part of a two-part sort of sermon that wasn't intended to be two-part initially, but it kind of ended up that way, given what I had last week. And so it's this sermon, that Eschew Obfuscation, Embrace Trepidation, Part 2. And when I told my wife about this, and actually I told my son too, and he had the same thing to say, I had said, what's the title? And I said, Eschew Obfuscation. He said, Dad, it's eschew. It's eschew. I said, no, it's eschew. He said, no, it's eschew. I said, look it up. He looks it up. Eschew, the most often cited pronunciation. Eschew, the second cited pronunciation. Eschew, the third, though not so often, pronunciation. What's your question? Obviously, I'm going to choose the least chosen one, right? That's my M.O. I'm going to go ahead and tell you this up front. I'm using a manuscript today because I feel a little trepidation myself. I feel a little like I'm on unsure footing, and so I decided to put this in front of me because more than usual, I'm going to lean on you a little, and I'm feeling a little tenuous, not just in this subject, but this whole what's been going on as I've been inundated with media, and as I've also swam in it, quite literally. And I'm increasingly aware of my anxiety and my grief, not just over what's been happening in Nepal and what's going on in our own country, but also this sense of helplessness that I've been feeling in terms of what can we do or what can I do about all of this. And I'm a little bit like my cat who I finally tossed out the door a week ago in the backyard. We're still feeding her. She's still our cat. But she has her claws, and she's a feral cat by birth, and she's been in the home for a year or two, or actually a couple of years, and it just wasn't working. Suffice it to say that we've lost a lot of clothing and carpet to our cat. Feral cats have no sense of orientation in terms of outhouses, so to speak. And so we put her out. Well, yesterday I'm on the second story of our house, and I see her in the tree, and I'm thinking, how wonderful, the cat's climbing trees. She'll chase away the squirrels that are living in our house. And as I see the cat, I realize she has climbed to a point of no return. It's somewhat new for her, obviously, but she's on this branch precariously, her feet sort of precariously grabbing hold of this thing, and she's looking for the nearest place to jump. And the tree down is obviously too steep. Easy enough to come up, hard to go down. And I watched her literally for 30 minutes as she was looking around for where she's going to leap. There was another branch that was probably 4 feet, but she could have easily made that. But in her state of unknowing, so to speak, this was going to be a little challenging. There was a roof about 5 feet away. Looked level. It was our neighbor's roof. I suppose she looked at that several times, and that's when I decided I'll go out and help her. And so I climbed the tree, which is when I realized I was on unsure footing. Because as I was climbing the tree, it was like the drowning trying to save the drowning. I was grabbing hold of a branch, and I reached out, and she looked at me like, what? I'm not turning that direction. And she clearly looked at me with this disdain and mockery, and then turned to leap over to the roof, at which point I grabbed her by the backside because I knew how much harder it was going to get her off the roof. And then I brought her in close, and she was clinging at me like I'm the most untrustworthy ground available. And I actually made my way down far enough to drop her and then jump from where I was in the tree. And I was only, 4 feet off the ground, but at any rate, that was still, I was actually like 15, but it... Thomas Merton spoke of an unseen thread that unites us, that joins everything together, something almost mystical, and in fact something that most religious traditions speak of, which he called the hidden wholeness. It's our deepest and our oldest home. He called it our connection to God. In truth, it's not really that hidden. In fact, it may be that it's just so immense that it's hard for us to hold on to. It's hard for us to get in view for very long. In truth, At birth, we already begin to differentiate ourselves from one another. We differentiate ourselves from the systems of others. We grow up in the system that we're raised in, and pretty soon we identify with what might be called a heuristic bias, just sort of the way we see things that we're not even conscious of, but it's a part of who we are. The social network becomes a part of that because it becomes a part of who we are as a family system within that network. And pretty soon, what we were once a part of, we quickly lose track of, and we get caught up in living out of what I called last week the little mind, this reality around ourselves. In essence, we forget about the vine. We're focused on the branch. We're focused on our own fruit. So to take that analogy a little further, John Wesley called it prevenient grace. This idea that no matter where we are, when we're born, whatever we are, who we are born into God's grace. We are born into connectedness with God regardless. That's why we baptize infants. It's not for the infant's sake, it's to remind us we're all connected. We're already connected to God. The German theologian of the 17th century, Friedrich Schleiermacher, called it our God consciousness. That the task of the Christian, so to speak, is to figure out how to get back to that bigger consciousness. Thomas Merton called it the hidden wholeness. Well, perhaps it's so large, that's why we can't perceive it. Perhaps it's more like Neil deGrasse Tyson, who says our interconnectedness is with the universe because we're made up of the stuff of the universe, even as the universe is made up of us then. We are connected. The Gospel of John calls it the vine. The Apostle Paul, and even Paul Tillich, the 20th century ethicist, calls it the ground of our being, the one in whom we live and move and have our being. There's a delicate balance to this connectedness. And we can feel it sometimes, I think, when we're out of sync. Our mirror neurons begin to react to the anxieties of others with the pain of others, and we experience discomfort, we experience worry and fear, and we fall back into this idea of what I called last week, this little mind. We begin to live out of this anxiety, out of this narrowness. And it becomes the only thing that's important. Do you have a picture of that grove of aspens? There's a grove in Utah that is something like 100, no, it's not that one. I'm not sure if you actually got it. It's the yellow aspen trees. Did I forget to send that to you? No, that's all right. If he finds it, that's great. But it's called Pando, the Pando. It is technically the largest living organism on the earth. Aside from the coral reef systems, this is the largest interconnected single entity on the earth. Every single tree there is connected by one root system. And they're basically clones. They basically grow from the same root. It started with one tree. And it's been around, for some suggest, for as much as 10, maybe 20,000 years. It's the only thing like that, of that size, a couple of hundred acres in size. If one of the trees dies, then the rest simply nourish that spot. The roots all work together to create another tree in that spot. It seems like we get back into this idea of little mind and we forget just how connected that we are. I spent the week looking at all sorts of blog posts and all of the news because I was concerned about what was happening, not just in Nepal, but closer to home in Baltimore. And it seemed to be the discussions around here as well as it might be around your place of work or perhaps your home. And the more that I began to review these things, the more I was overwhelmed with this reality that the opinions were actually quite polarized, which really struck me as odd. It seemed pretty obvious to me that there's a significant racial imbalance in our culture. That seems obvious. It seems like there's some injustice in our culture. It seems like there's economic disparity, that there's educational inequality. It seems like that, like healthcare is not the same for everyone, that we're not all born into the same opportunities. It seems like that. And yet, in spite of that, there was this great debate among these bloggers and the commentary. And I wasn't sure how this could be. It struck me as odd that in the light of another suspicious death of a black person in the custody of law enforcement, that instead of just asking questions, we're all defending positions. And I'm going to go out on a vine here, so to speak, And I'm going to suggest that, as I've suggested in here before, all of our biases and our prejudices and any, I'll say it personally, racist tendency that I may have, all of our fears and worries, they're ultimately our failure to see the connection. They're ultimately our inability to see how we are in fact connected. The common beat of our oneness is never far away. We can almost see this in any area of knowledge and experience. We find this sense of hidden wholeness as far back as the 17th century. The Dutch scientist Christian Huygens discovered this thing called biodynamic consonance. I've spoken about this a little bit before. He was the person who invented the pendulum clock. But what he discovered once when he was ill and in his bed was he laid two of these clocks beside themselves and set the pendulum in motion, both of them. And in short time, the two of them were swinging in consonance together. You can find this is true in almost any area of life. You can find this idea more even in our own cellular makeup, where scientists more recently took different cells from different hearts, two different hearts. They placed the cells in petri dishes, and within just a matter of a short time, these cells were actually mimicking each other and were essentially a heartbeat. They were essentially resonating with the same frequency. Like the pando, it seems we are at our best. We are at our most resonant when we're connected. It seems rooted in our very biological makeup. The reality of injustice hits us in the face every day if we listen, and sometimes it's a kick in the gut when we become saturated in our media with it. And then we see the aftermath, the anger, the riots, the destruction, and maybe we're incensed at this idea. Maybe we're incensed at the idea of what some would say, that rioting is the only voice some people have. And they seem to speak as if it's justified. And some of us may react with a sense of righteous indignation at the idea that we continue to live in a white supremacist reality. And so they shout in these blogs, "I'm not a racist. I can't think of anyone of color that I would hate or that I would want to do harm to or oppress." And we call out for the other side of the story to hear what the law enforcement side of the story might be. And we justify, in fact, that there is rampant violence. There is crime, unbelievable crime in these areas. But what I want to suggest to you when we think about this idea of little mind and big mind is that both opinions are wrong. Both opinions continue to look from the perspective of little mind. Both continue to operate from our sense of who we are ourselves. And so maybe we feel compelled to want to help, but yet we still don't see the connections. Or maybe we feel compelled to be afraid, and we still don't see the connections. Because what I would want to suggest is that perhaps what these young men and women, when they're destroying property in Baltimore, were doing was not what, in fact, Paul Tillich would have called living out of their courage to be connected to the ground of our being, but perhaps what was more likely the case is that they are, in fact, living out of their reality of disconnection. They are simply an example of the branch gone awry, perhaps seeking connection. Lord knows how many of us have found so many different ways that we've sought connection to something and yet still haven't found it. The sad thing is that what we might not realize, that's only conjecture by virtue of this text that we read, is that if the branch dies, more than likely the vine will die too. There are clear examples of people living out of this sense of the bigger picture, and it's not always received well. Rosa Parks, when she sat at the front of the bus, people say that was an act of defiance. It was an act of courage. She herself said that it was, in fact, an act of courage, but she simply said, "I learned at some point to put my trust in God and to see God as my strength. Long ago, I had set my mind to be a free person in the world and not to give in to my fear, not to give in to anyone's fear. I have learned over the years that when one's mind is made up, this diminishes fear. Knowing what must be done does away with fear." I think of Reverend Frank Schaefer, who was a United Methodist pastor, and I spoke last week of some of the dialogue that our own conference and church was in wrestling with this idea of same-sex marriage within the United Methodist Church, with the language that's in our current discipline. That's a topic for another day in terms of what the conversation, how that happened, and what went on. But I think of Reverend Frank Schaefer in this context simply because he's a pastor in Pennsylvania who was defrocked in 2013 as rebelling against authority, insulting, striking a battle stance with his own annual conference and his bishop because he had performed the wedding ceremony for his son and his son's partner. This was back in 2007. In 2013, they defrocked him. In 2014, 6 months later, a council appealed this, and eventually his pastoral leadership and involvement in the church was reinstated. Was he simply deeply connecting to the greater presence of love and celebrating the joy and hope and witness of life that's so present when any two people who are deeply committed to one another for life are examples of compassion and joy? There are many ways that we connect with one another, and yet so many ways that we stay in little mind convinced of our deepest commitment to our own narratives, the stories we tell about ourselves. Anne Lamott, the writer Anne Lamott, had this wonderful saying. She said, "I don't like to spend too much time with my own stories. I don't like to spend too much time in my own head." She said, "It's like going to a bad neighborhood all by yourself." I like it because I can really identify with that. I very rarely bring people along, and it probably would be a good idea when I go into my head to say, "Would you sit with me while I listen to myself?" There's so many ways that we try to connect with one another, but I think what we need to be recognized in our deep culture is this idea that we feel like we have to accomplish something, and that we need to let go of that. I was reading in these blog posts, I guess, Austin, go ahead and go to the picture of Moose Mountain. I was reading in these blog posts, and every one of them, of course, were dealing with what's going on in Baltimore and then what's going on in Nepal. But one had the sort of audacity to speak about questioning Mount Everest and questioning whether or not we should be climbing Mount Everest. Now, I would suggest that it's not so much that it's a sidestep away from some of the most tragic and more desperate things that are going on in the world, but it does raise an interesting question in the context of what we're talking about this morning. So many people, since the first person ever climbed Everest, are now climbing Mount Everest. Hundreds are climbing Mount Everest at a time. Great groups of people are gathering in these Sherpa-driven hikes up and climbs up the mountain. And it's very expensive. And what's happened is it's becoming sort of a bragging right for those who can afford it. I remember hiking at a camp. It was called Camp Kendall. It's still around. It's a camp outside of Calgary in Alberta, not far from Banff, if you've ever been to Banff. It's beautiful, beautiful. The Cascade Mountains are amazing. This is one of the mountains there. One of the things that this camp does, these are kids who have cancer. One of these things that the camp does is with the older kids, they take a trip. All of the kids take different trips. It's not in their philosophy. It's not necessarily something that they vocalize. You can just see that it's something they understand deep within them. Our sickness is not our identity. That's essentially what they're saying. Our illness is not who we are. It's not our narrative. It's just a part of it. It's part of the journey. The mountain reminds us that the picture is much bigger. And so they take these kids out onto these adventure trips, some of which are quite treacherous and dangerous. This is not one of the more difficult mountains, but you can see there are some pretty steep trails. And we climbed this mountain. I joined them on a 2-day trip with the senior high. And halfway up this Moose Mountain, it was interesting. I was talking to the doctor, the oncologist, who said that she's looking to climb Mount Everest. But I asked her why, and she said it's because she needs this connection. She needs to be connected to something grander. I didn't go into any theological, philosophical conversation at that point. I simply just tried to understand what it was she was saying. Now, she had money, But she'd been working on this for years. She'd been climbing mountains all over the place in lieu of the one big mountain that she wanted to climb. It wasn't, I've got the money, I'm going to train, and there'll be at least 15 or 20 Sherpas to make sure I can make it up the mountain. She literally saw this as her personal connection. She said that's what's important for all these kids, to know that they can do this, but not simply to know that they can do this, to know that they are not alone in their lives. And I saw that in practice. As about halfway up, a couple of kids had to stop. They just couldn't go any further. And what was interesting, as compared to those people who want to do Mount Everest as a sort of a bragging right, or perhaps they want to run a century-mile race because of the bragging right, this sense of, I can do this and I can show you what I can accomplish. Instead of that, it was more this sense of, we're taking this one step at a time. We're going to see where this leads us. The top isn't the pinnacle. The moment's the pinnacle. Where we are right now. And so while some of them could only get about halfway up, others stayed with them and hiked around that area. And they stayed kind of focused on the wonders that were present right there with them. When we got to the top, you can go to the next picture. It's interesting. When we got to the top, actually one more picture. See if it's in the next picture. Is there a next picture? Oh, that was it? Oh, I thought I sent you a picture of the actual fire lookout. It's interesting, the actual fire lookout is a very tiny, if you go back one picture, you can see it at the top of the mountain peak right there. You can see just barely where it is up at the very top. At the very top of that is this tiny little one-room fire lookout where someone will stay for 4 to 6 months at a time. You'd think they'd go crazy. You talk to them and you think they are a little crazy. The guy was making African koras, these wild stringed instruments. He was making drums. He was weaving blankets. He spent a lot of time looking out at the woods and the forests, and then spending a lot of time just building and making things, and then sort of anxiously excited whenever somebody would show up, and he would serve them he would serve us like a cup of his canned soup or something, and we would sort of have fun visiting with him. The outhouse, you can just barely see it. It's off to the side there. You actually have to walk along a tiny little edge. If you look online, it's called the loneliest outhouse in the world because it literally hangs on the edge. He was like, you don't ever want to do that at night. At least one aspect of what I think Jesus was saying with his disciples and what the early mystics were saying is that God consciousness, that being connected to God, has more to do with big mind. It has more to do with our being a part of the bigger picture, of recognizing our place in the bigger picture. I want to share with you one quick little short story and then a final thought. One other camp I got to experience was one of the most transformative lessons I learned about this sense of connectedness, about what one person can do to open up the window of connection to other people. We were at this camp called Camp One-a-Clot. One-a-Clot. It's a hemophilia camp. So it's called One-a-Clot because blood clotting is a problem, right? It's out in Georgia, and as we were outside of Atlanta, and as we were at this camp, there was another camp that was going on. It was a cystic fibrosis camp. They don't do those camps anymore because of the high risk of infection. Cystic fibrosis, because of its limited outcome and its sort of short prognosis, so to speak, it's a tense place. It can be a tense space. We were sharing the two camps together in this one space. And it created some tension because of the directors had history. They had a history. And so the power plays were happening in the midst of these two camps trying to function side by side. And the tension began to, like a vine and like a branch on a vine, make its way throughout all of the other little fingers of that camp. Other counselors getting caught up in the tension. Campers not knowing what's going on, but crying for no real reason. Just the tension in the space was palpable. And then one afternoon, 2 days into this camp, a local Cherokee woman who is an alternative therapist, she does alternative medical therapies, she came at the camp and said, I've been invited to come here to do a spirit naming for a horse. Well, it's an old tradition within the Cherokee nation, this idea of naming the horse. And the process of naming a horse is a process of being present to the environment and waiting for what calls out. and whoever's doing that naming to be connected in that way, and for all who are watching to be connected in that way. And so both camps lined around the stables and watched in the middle of this stable as this woman worked with this horse, like a horse whisperer almost, just kind of whispering, walking around, the horse nudging and snuggling with her, until after a while she came up with the name. Took about 45 minutes. There was silence, and as you looked around, some were crying. Afterwards, everyone wanted a spirit name. All the kids, the counselors were lined up with this woman. It's like, how long are you going to be with the camp? I want a spirit name. And what it said to me was that everyone wanted to be connected. Everyone longed to be a part of something bigger. And when they felt that, everything else seemed to fall in place. So I want to conclude with this idea. Our differences are so much easier to see than our similarities. When I see two women walking into a coffee shop and they're wearing their robes and their scarves, and now I'm forgetting their hijab. When they're wearing the hijab, I think something strange. I see two men holding hands and walking their dog at Trinity Park, and I think, how strange and how sort of awkward and uncomfortable for me. But it's only the difference in that I am thinking and using my little mind, or what we might call branch thinking. From that vantage point, all I can see is my own bias, my own ingrained neural patterns, my own little, what businesses call, hairball. I'm caught up in the system, and I can't see any way out. And when I see someone across on the other side of the country, because of their skin color, I think they're a violent people. I think they're a crime-oriented people, a careless and selfish people. But maybe instead I could see a bigger picture. Maybe I could learn how to simply acknowledge where it is that I'm not seeing the whole picture. Acknowledge that I am, in fact, seeing out of my own mindset, out of my own little mind, and begin to have a little bigger mind picture so that I can see two people who are, in fact, like I would long to be. The two women are, in fact, living out of their own desire to be deeply connected to something bigger, to what they see as something bigger. And that the desperate young black men are seeking honestly to be connected in a way that they have not been able to be connected. And so they act out of desperation, as any of us do when we find ourselves at the last line, at the last opportunity to do anything. Or when I see two men together and I realize that they are, in fact, deeply connected and committed in love. And that same love that I wish I could experience, or that you could experience, or that any one of us would want to experience. When I see my own fears and anxieties, and when I acknowledge that, then I suddenly become curious, suddenly, to what is holy in our midst. And I start to seek understanding. Annie Dillard said that seeing is not just a matter of looking, it's a matter of acknowledging. But there's also a way of seeing that is letting go. Looking, letting go. Something about that old parable about the guy wandering through the field and suddenly stumbling on a treasure, I think is what Annie Dillard is getting at when she says, it's only when we acknowledge what we see and let go that we discover the treasure. Amen.